The August sun beat down on Silas Blackwood's neck, hot and heavy as a blacksmith's anvil. Sweat traced salty paths through the grease, and dust caked on his face, stinging his eyes. Before him, silent and stubborn, sat the Alice Chalmers All-Crop 60. To call it a combine was a generous stretch of the term. It was a pull type, a relic from the 40s, a tired orange box of rattling chains and worn-out canvases that his father had bought used, and his grandfather would have recognized. It was his only way to get the soybeans out of the field, and right now the main drive chain lay in 2 greasy pieces in the dirt. A link had snapped. Not a clean break, but a twisted, ugly shear that spoke of metal fatigue that was probably older than Silas himself. He'd spent the better part of the morning trying to rig the master link from his toolbox to join the broken ends, but the remaining links were stretched and distorted. It wouldn't hold. He knew it wouldn't hold. He could hear the faint, distant hum of progress from the west. That would be Warren Slater. Slater's farm bordered his own, separated by a thin line of ancient oaks and a world of difference in philosophy. The hum grew steadily louder, resolving itself into the confident, throaty growl of a brand-new John Deere 4020 diesel, its power-shift transmission whining contentedly. Silas didn't have to look. He could picture it perfectly. The brilliant green paint still glossy, the wide front axle, the black padded seat that was more comfortable than the armchair in his own living room. And behind it, Slater would be pulling not a planter or a disc, but his own combine, a self-propelled John Deere. 55, another recent acquisition. The sound crested the gentle rise, and the green machine came into view, Slater perched on it like a king on his throne. He slowed the 4020 as he drew parallel with Silas's fence line, the diesel engine settling into a deep, rumbling idle. Slater, a man whose gut was already starting to push against the buttons of his work shirt, tipped his brand-new John Deere cap back on his head. A smug little smile played on his lips. "Trouble in paradise, Blackwood?" he called out, his voice carrying easily across the 100 yards of dry soybean rows. Silas didn't answer. He just wiped a forearm across his brow, leaving another streak of black grease. He picked up the broken chain, the metal hot from the sun, and stared at it, as if the force of his will could weld it back together. Slater wasn't one to be ignored. He throttled the 4020 down even further, and swung himself off the operator's platform with the practiced ease of a man who'd never known a stiff back. He ambled over to the fence, hooking his thumbs in his new denim overalls. "That thing belongs in a museum, you know that?" Slater said, nodding toward the Alice. "My granddad had one of those. Sold it for scrap in 52. "It gets the job done," Silas finally mumbled, his voice tight. It was a lie, and they both knew it. Right now it was doing nothing but mocking him under the oppressive heat. "Does it?" Slater chuckled. It wasn't a friendly sound. It was the sound of a man who'd just signed a loan at the bank for the latest and greatest, a man who saw debt not as a risk, but as a tool. "I'll be done with my beans by Saturday. Looks like you'll be praying that first snow holds off till Christmas." He gestured with his chin back toward his own rig. "That 55, she'll eat up 100 acres and not even burp. This old girl." He looked at the Alice with pity. "She'll probably choke on a corn stalk." Silas felt a hot flush of anger creep up his neck, a heat that had nothing to do with the sun. He thought of his father, a man who had died just 2 years prior, leaving him with 160 acres of paid-for land and a deeply ingrained distrust of bankers. "Never let another man own your sweat, son," he'd always said. "The interest you pay is just another man's wages for work you did yourself." His father had farmed through the Depression. He'd seen neighbors with bigger barns and newer tractors lose it all when the notes came due. That fear, That caution was baked into the Blackwood soil. "I don't have a payment on it," Silas said, his voice low and steady. "It's mine. Every bolt and every broken chain." Slater laughed out loud this time. "And that's what you'll have when the bank takes this place, Blackwood. A pile of paid-for rusty bolts. You can't farm in 1968 with your daddy's equipment and your granddaddy's ideas. It's a new age. You gotta spend money to make money." He pushed off the fence post. "Well, don't let me keep you. You've got, another hour of daylight?" He swaggered back to his tractor, the green paint seeming to glow with superiority. The diesel engine roared back to life, and with a wave that was more of a dismissal than a greeting, he was off, leaving Silas alone in a cloud of dust and the lingering smell of modern horsepower. Silas stood there for a long moment, the broken chain heavy in his hand. The silence that descended was profound, broken only by the buzz of a horsefly and the rustle of the dry soybean leaves. He looked at his hands, the knuckles skinned raw, the fingernails permanently rimmed with black. He looked at the old Farmall M tractor, parked in front of the combine, its narrow front end and faded red paint, a testament to decades of hard labor. It was his, all of it. But Slater's words echoed in the quiet field. Was he a fool? Was his father's wisdom now just a recipe for failure? He was 24 years old, holding the deed to this land, but Slater made him feel like a boy playing with his father's forgotten toys. He looked back toward the west, where the dust cloud from Slater's new combine was already shrinking toward the horizon. The gulf between them felt wider than just a fence line. It was a chasm of belief, of debt, of what it meant to be a farmer in this changing world. And as he stood there, wrestling with the broken chain and the broken pride, he knew this was more than just a bad day. It was the start of a war, a quiet, grinding war, that would be fought not with guns, but with grease and sweat and the ever-present threat of a banker's signature. Before we go any further into this story, I have to ask you folks watching, have you ever been in a spot like Silas, pushing an old machine, praying it would just make it through one more season, one more acre, while the world seemed to be passing you by with shiny new paint? Let me know down in the comments what piece of iron you kept alive against all odds. I'd love to read about it. The trip to Miller's salvage yard was a journey into a mechanical graveyard. Rusted hulks of tractors and combines sat in silent, crooked rows, their paint bleached by decades of sun, and their metal slowly returning to the earth. It smelled of rust, old oil, and damp soil. For Silas, it was a place of both frustration and opportunity. Mr. Miller, a stooped man with hands as gnarled as oak roots, pointed him toward the back corner. "Got a couple old Alice pull types back by the creek," he'd grunted. "Been there since Eisenhower was in office. Pick what you want." Silas found them, two all-crop 60s listing to one side, their tires long since rotted away, sinking into the soft ground. Weeds grew up through their frames, and a family of raccoons had made a home in the grain hopper of one. But the drive chains, protected from the worst of the elements, looked promising. He spent 2 hours in the mud and thorns with a breaker bar and a can of penetrating oil, fighting rusted bolts and frozen pins. Finally, with a groan of protesting metal, a 10-foot section of chain came free. It was greasy, caked with ancient chaff, but the links were solid. He paid Mr. Miller $2 for it and hauled it home in the bed of his beat-up Ford pickup. Back in his workshop, the real work began. The shed wasn't much: dirt floor, a few bare bulbs hanging from the rafters. But it was his sanctuary. He laid the salvage chain next to his broken one on the workbench. Using a caliper, he measured the pitch, the distance between the pins. They were close enough. He spent the next hour with a wire wheel on his bench grinder, cleaning each link of the salvaged section, the air filling with the acrid smell of burning grease and fine rust particles. He then soaked it in a pan of diesel fuel, working the grit out of the rollers with a stiff brush until the metal gleamed a dull silver under the weak light. He didn't just replace the broken link, he replaced the entire worn section of his old chain. This meant driving out the pins on both ends, a task that required a heavy punch, a 3-pound hammer, and a steady hand. One misplaced blow could mushroom the end of the pin, making it impossible to remove. Sweat dripped from his nose onto the cold steel as he focused, the rhythmic clang of hammer on punch echoing in the small shed. Finally, the old section was out. He carefully fitted the new one, using a C-clamp to press the side plate over the pins before peening the ends with a ball-peen hammer, creating a soft, rounded head that would hold it fast. It was slow, meticulous work. It was the kind of work Warren Slater paid a dealership mechanic a fortune to avoid. By the time he was done, the sun had set and the chorus of crickets had started up. His stomach rumbled, but he ignored it. He carried the repaired chain out to the field, the metal cool in his hands now. Working by the headlights of his truck, he threaded the chain through the sprockets, his fingers finding their way by feel in the darkness. He connected the ends with the master link, snapping the cotter pin into place with a satisfying click. He took a deep breath, the air cool and damp. He climbed onto the seat of the Farmall M, pulled the choke, and hit the starter. The old tractor coughed to life with a plume of blue smoke. He engaged the P2O. For a moment, there was only the familiar clatter of the tractor. Then, with a groan and a squeal, the guts of the all-crop 60 began to turn. The canvases flapped, the sickle bar reciprocated, and the drive chain, his repaired, resurrected drive chain, held. It ran true, a dark, greasy ribbon of steel turning smoothly over the sprockets. A wave of relief, so powerful it almost made him dizzy, washed over Silas. He had won. Not the war, but this battle. The rest of that harvest was a blur of 14-hour days. He ran the old combine slow, listening intently for any change in its mechanical symphony, any new squeak or rattle that might signal another failure. He learned its moods, the way it labored in damp straw, the way the canvases would slip if he went too fast around a curve. He was out there long after Slater had finished, working under the cold autumn moon, the lone headlights of his tractor, a tiny beacon in the vast darkness. The talk at the co-op grain elevator was merciless. Saw Silas was still out there last night, one farmer would say over coffee. Heard he's harvesting one bean at a time with a pair of tweezers. The others would chuckle. Warren Slater, holding court near the scale, would just shake his head with theatrical pity. Poor kid's gonna work himself into an early grave trying to make a living with that junk. Told him he needs to get with the times. Even his father-in-law, a good man named Thomas, who had always supported him, pulled him aside one Sunday after church. "Silas," he began, his voice laced with concern. "Mary's worried about you. You're running yourself ragged. The bank's loaning money hand over fist right now. Maybe it's time you considered upgrading. Just a little. A newer planter, maybe?" "I'm fine, Thomas," Silas said, though the weariness was a physical weight on his shoulders. "I'll get the crop in." "It's not just about getting it in, son. It's about having a life. Slater's taking his wife to Florida for a week once he's done. You'll be lucky if you're done by the first frost." Silas didn't have an answer for that. He just nodded and promised to think about it. But he knew he wouldn't. Every dollar he made that wasn't for seed, fuel, or repairs went into a savings account at the bank. It was a pittance compared to the cost of new equipment, but it was his. It was the foundation. He finished his harvest 2 days before the first heavy snow fell. His yields were down. The slow pace meant he'd lost more beans to shatter than Slater had. The elevator docked him for moisture content because the last of it came off damp. When all was said and done, his profit for the year was meager. Slater, on the other hand, had a bumper crop and was already talking about buying the 80-acre parcel to the north of his property. At the community Thanksgiving dinner, Slater loudly announced his purchase, and the room broke into applause. Silas sat at his table, his wife Mary squeezing his hand under the tablecloth, and forced a smile. He felt the sting of failure, sharp and bitter. He was working harder than anyone, yet falling further behind. The chasm was widening. The next few years followed a similar pattern. Each season was a new struggle, a fresh test of his mechanical ingenuity and his physical endurance. The old Farmall Ems engine developed a knock, and he spent a miserable winter week with the engine block hanging from a chain hoist, grinding the valves and replacing the rod bearings himself. The corn planter, a 4-row International, broke a drive gear, and he had to learn how to weld cast iron, preheating the part with a torch and using high nickel rods to stitch the broken teeth back together. He became a master of improvisation, a connoisseur of the salvage yard. He knew which John Deere hydraulic pump could be made to fit his Farmall with a custom-milled bracket, and which Ford wheel bearings were identical to the ones on his old grain wagon. His farm was a patchwork of mismatched color, a red tractor, an orange combine, a silver grain bin, a green planter he'd bought for scrap and rebuilt. To everyone else, it looked like a mess. To Silas, every piece of it was a victory, a testament to his refusal to surrender to the bank. While Slater paraded a new piece of green and yellow equipment home every spring, Silas was quietly improving the foundation of his farm. He put his meager profits not into iron, but into the land itself. He spent one spring tiling the low-lying 20 acres near the creek, laying thousands of feet of perforated plastic pipe by hand with a rented trencher. It was back-breaking, muddy work. Slater had laughed when he saw him. "Still playing in the mud, Blackwood? I just hired the county to pattern tile my new 80. Be done in a week." But the following year, a wet spring left half of Slater's new field too saturated to plant on time. Silas's tiled ground, however, was dry and ready. He got his corn in early, and it never suffered from the wet feet that stunted Slater's crop. It was a small victory, one nobody but him seemed to notice. But it was enough. It was proof that his way, the slow, steady, debt-free way, had merit. He wasn't just surviving, he was building. Then in the early 1970s, the world changed. News came trickling through the radio, reports of a massive grain sale to the Soviet Union. The impact was immediate and seismic. Wheat prices, which had been stagnant for years, doubled. Corn and soybeans followed, soaring to heights no one had ever seen. Suddenly, farming wasn't just a living. It was a gold rush. A wave of unprecedented optimism swept through the heartland. For men like Warren Slater, it was the ultimate validation. The soaring commodity prices meant the value of his crops, and therefore his land, skyrocketed. The banks, eager to cash in on the boom, saw farmers as their most reliable customers. They threw money at them. The local John Deere dealership couldn't keep equipment on the lot. Slater, flush with cash and credit, went on a buying spree. He traded his 4020 for a brand new 42430 with the revolutionary SoundGuard cab, an enclosed, air-conditioned, whisper-quiet operator station that was the pinnacle of farm comfort. He bought the 120 acres on his western border, financing the entire purchase. and his crowning glory was a monstrous John Deere 700 turbo combine. It was a machine of breathtaking scale and power, capable of harvesting 8 rows of corn at a time. When it was delivered on a lowboy trailer, half the township drove by just to stare at it. Slater became a local celebrity, the poster boy for the new era of aggressive, expansionist farming. The local paper did a feature on him, complete with a picture of him and his family standing in front of the gleaming new combine, the headline reading, "Warren Slater, Farming for the Future." In the article, he was quoted as saying, "You can't be timid. In this business, you get big or get out. Land is the one thing they're not making any more of, and I plan to own as much of it as I can." Silas felt the pull of the boom, too. The prices for his corn and beans were just as high as Slater's. For the first time in his life, he had a substantial amount of money in the bank at the end of the year. The temptation was immense. He walked the John Deere lot one afternoon, running his hand over the fender of a new 4230. He could feel the solidness of it, could almost smell the new paint and vinyl. The dealer, who usually barely gave him the time of day, was suddenly his best friend. "Silas, with today's prices, this tractor will pay for itself in 2 years. We can have the paperwork done in an hour. Your signature is all it takes." He thought of the long nights in his cold shop, of the skinned knuckles and the constant worry. He could end all that. He could have reliability. He could have air conditioning and a radio. He could be like Slater. But then he thought of his father. He thought of the interest charts the banker had shown him, the numbers that seemed small at first, but grew into mountains over time. He thought of what it would feel like to have that note hanging over his head, to know that every bushel he harvested was already partly owned by the bank. He walked away from the dealership. Instead of a new tractor, Silas took his windfall and did something no one saw. He drove to the county seat and walked into the bank, not to the loan officer's desk, but to the mortgage department. He paid off the last remaining $10,000 on the original farm mortgage, a debt his father had taken on 30 years before. The clerk, a woman who had known his family for years, stamped the document "paid in full" with a heavy, satisfying thud. As she handed it to him, she smiled. "Your father would be very proud, Silas." Holding that deed, free and clear, felt better than any new tractor ever could. With the money he had left, he didn't buy iron. He bought security. He built a proper, insulated machine shed with a concrete floor and bright fluorescent lights. He ran a heavy-duty power line to it and bought a used but powerful milling machine and a heavy industrial lathe. He was investing not in payments, but in his own independence. He could now make parts he once had to buy. He replaced his worn-out Alice combine, not with a new 7700, but with a well-maintained 5-year-old International Harvester 715. It was a solid, reliable machine, and most importantly, he paid for it with a check, not a signature on a loan. To the outside world, his choices were baffling. He was seen as a man hopelessly stuck in the past, a failure who couldn't see the golden opportunity in front of him. At the diner, the consensus was that Silas Blackwood had no ambition. "Slater's got 1,000 acres now," they'd say. "Silas is still sitting on the same 160 his daddy had. The boy's got no vision." One crisp autumn evening, Silas was at the co-op, waiting to unload his last wagon of corn. Warren Slater pulled up alongside him in his shiny new pickup truck. The 7700 had finished his harvest weeks ago. "Still at it, Blackwood?" Slater said, leaning out the window. He wasn't smiling. There was an edge to his voice, a hint of genuine annoyance, as if Silas's mere existence and his refusal to play the game were a personal affront. "Almost done," Silas replied calmly. "You know," Slater said, shaking his head. "I just don't get you. You could be making real money. You could be expanding. Instead, you're tinkering with that old IH and building a new shed to store your junk in. You're playing for pennies when there are dollars on the table." "I sleep pretty well at night, Warren," Silas said, looking him straight in the eye. Slater just scoffed. "You sleep. I build an empire." He gunned his engine and peeled out of the gravel lot. Later that week, listening to the radio as he cleaned up his new shop, Silas heard a news report. The announcer's voice was somber. He spoke of runaway inflation, of the Federal Reserve chairman vowing to break its back, no matter the cost. He mentioned interest rates, a term Silas had spent his life trying to avoid. The prime rate, the announcer said, had just ticked up to 12% and was expected to keep climbing. Silas shut off the radio and stood in the quiet of his new shop, the smell of fresh concrete and steel filling the air. He looked at his paid-for tractor, his paid-for combine, and his debt-free land. A cold knot of unease tightened in his stomach. He didn't know much about high finance or federal policy, but he knew what happened when the cost of borrowing money went up. And he knew that Warren Slater's empire, gleaming and green and impressive as it was built entirely on a foundation of borrowed money. The gold rush, he suspected, was about to end. And the reckoning was going to be brutal. The first sign of trouble wasn't a storm cloud or a broken-down machine. It was a voice on the radio, a calm, authoritative voice from Washington, D.C., announcing a full embargo on grain sales to the Soviet Union. It was meant to be a political statement, a piece of geopolitical chess played on a global scale, but for the farmers in the heartland, it was a punch to the gut. The market, which had been a raging bull for nearly a decade, stopped dead in its tracks. The price of corn, which had seemed destined to climb forever, fell 30 cents a bushel overnight. At the co-op, the mood soured. The easy optimism of the 70s evaporated like a morning fog. Warren Slater, who had held court there for years, was now quiet. His face, a mask of tight-lipped anxiety. His entire operation, his 1,000-acre empire, was predicated on high commodity prices. His loan payments were calculated on the assumption of $5 corn, not $3 corn. The second sign was the price of fuel. Long lines appeared at the gas stations in town. The cost of diesel fuel, the lifeblood of every farm, doubled, then nearly tripled. Slater's new 4430 and his monstrous 7700 combine, with its turbocharged 404 cubic inch engine, were thirsty machines. Silas heard the talk. Slater's monthly fuel bill from the co-op was now more than what Silas spent on fuel in an entire year. The Soundguard cab was still quiet, but the peace it offered was now a terribly expensive luxury. Silas felt the squeeze too, but it was different for him. His old Farm All M and his International 715 combine were models of fuel efficiency compared to Slater's new fleet. When the price of a new hydraulic filter at the dealership jumped by 50%, Silas took his old one apart, cleaned the fine mesh screen with solvent, and put it back in. He sharpened the blades on his sickle bar himself, using a file and a steady hand, while Slater simply bought new sections by the box. Each small act of self-sufficiency was another stone in the wall he was building against the coming storm. The third and most brutal sign was the interest rates. The Federal Reserve's war on inflation was relentless. The prime rate, which had been a single digit when Slater signed his biggest loans, began a terrifying climb into the teens. His loans weren't fixed. They were variable. Every time the rate ticked up, the bank sent him a new letter, the numbers on it growing more and more fantastic. The interest payments alone were now a crushing weight, consuming every dollar he made, and then some. The first real crack in Slater's empire appeared one Tuesday in May. Silas was cultivating his corn, the old 4-row cultivator scratching along behind the Farmall M when he saw the dealership's service truck turn into Slater's lane. It was there for a long time. Later that day, at the parts counter, Silas overheard the mechanic talking. The hydrostatic transmission on Slater's 4430 had failed. It was a catastrophic failure, a multi-thousand-dollar repair requiring specialized tools and a week of downtime, right in the middle of the planting season. A week later, Silas saw Slater planting his last 80 acres of soybeans, not with his state-of-the-art John Deere 7000 planter, but with an old, rusty John Deere drill he'd borrowed from his brother-in-law. The story at the diner was that Slater couldn't afford the repair bill on the tractor, and the dealership wouldn't release it until he paid. He was forced to use his smaller utility tractor, the old 4020 he'd thankfully never traded in, to finish his planting. It was a public humiliation. The king had been forced to use his old, discarded tools, the very kind of equipment he had once mocked Silas for owning. That summer was hot and dry. The sky remained a pale, cloudless blue for weeks on end. The corn, stressed for moisture, began to curl its leaves in the afternoon heat, a silent, desperate prayer for rain. For Slater, the drought was a death sentence. His crops, planted late and in compacted soil, withered. His yields were going to be a disaster, and he needed a bumper crop just to have a chance of breaking even. Silas's corn fared better. The tiling he had installed years ago now paid a different kind of dividend. It had drained the excess moisture in the wet years, but it had also allowed the roots to grow deeper, to tap into the subsoil moisture that Slater's shallow-rooted crops couldn't reach. His fields stayed green a week longer than his neighbors. It wasn't a miracle, but it was an edge. The chasm between them was no longer about philosophy. It was about survival. Slater's farm, once a symbol of progress, now looked like a monument to hubris. Weeds were starting to show up in his soybean fields because he'd skipped a pass with the sprayer to save on chemical costs. A fence on his back 40 was down, his cattle grazing on the roadside because he didn't have the time or the money to fix it. Silas, on the other hand, continued his steady pace. His fences were tight, his fields were clean, and his machinery, though old, was always in perfect repair. He was a ship sailing with patched sails and a solid hull, while Slater was the captain of a gleaming new ocean liner that was taking on water, its powerful engines threatening to drown in a sea of red ink. The fall of 1982 was the quietest harvest Silas could remember. The usual frantic energy was gone, replaced by a grim, pervasive sense of dread. The air didn't crackle with the roar of diesel engines and the promise of profit. It hung heavy with the silence of parked machinery and broken dreams. Farm auction notices began to appear in the local paper like funeral announcements. First, it was the young guys, the ones who had jumped in at the peak of the boom, their operations collapsing like houses of cards. Then, it began to claim the established families, men who had farmed the same ground for generations. The bank finally called Warren Slater's notes in January. The commodity prices were in the basement, and land values had plummeted by 40%. He was over-leveraged and insolvent. There was no more extending credit, no more restructuring. The dream was over. The auction was held on a bitterly cold Saturday in March. A raw wind whipped across the farmyard, carrying flurries of snow and the mournful lowing of the cattle in the sale pen. Half the county was there, not in celebration, but as witnesses to a tragedy. They walked through Slater's machine shed, their hands in their pockets, their faces grim. The equipment was lined up in neat, funereal rows. The 4430 tractor, its transmission now repaired, but its paint job faded by worry. The massive 7000 planter, the discs and plows and wagons, and at the end of the line, like a deposed king, sat the John Deere 7700 turbo combine, It was only a few years old, but it looked tired, an icon of an era that had ended in ruin. Slater and his wife stood on the porch of their house, watching as the auctioneer's rhythmic chant disassembled their life, piece by piece. Warren was a ghost of the man he'd once been. The cocky swagger was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed stare. He had aged 10 years in one. He wasn't a villain. He was a man who had believed the gospel of modern finance and had been crucified by it. Silas was there, but he didn't bid on the machinery. He had no need for it. His own shed was full of paid-for iron that he knew how to fix. He watched as Slater's neighbors and rivals picked over the bones of his empire for pennies on the dollar. The 7700 Combine, which had cost Slater over $100,000, sold for $35,000 to a corporate farm from 2 counties over. The auctioneer's cry of "sold" echoed across the yard like a judge's gavel. Silas's own survival through the crisis was a quiet, unglamorous affair. While others were meeting with bankers, he was in his shop. When the feeder chain on his IH Combine broke, he didn't call a dealer. He took a link to his workbench, heated it in the forge until it glowed cherry red, and welded it shut. He ground it smooth and put it back on. The repair cost him a few cents worth of electricity and welding rod. His low overhead was his salvation. He wasn't making much money, but he wasn't losing it either. His farm was an island of stability. He became an unlikely resource for his neighbors. When their newer, more complex machines broke down and they couldn't afford the dealer's prices, they would come to Silas. He'd spend an evening in his shop, turning a new shaft on his lathe, or milling a replacement gear, charging them only for the materials. He never asked for much, but the favors were always returned. A side of beef, help putting up hay, a few dozen eggs from a neighbor's wife. In the midst of economic collapse, the old currency of community was making a comeback, and Silas Blackwood, the man they once called a fool, was one of its richest citizens. He was proving his father's wisdom right, day by agonizing day. It wasn't about getting big or getting out. It was about staying. 2 weeks after the equipment auction, the final notice was posted on the door of the county courthouse. Slater's land, all 1,000 acres of it, was being sold. The bank had repossessed it and was putting it up for public auction to satisfy the remainder of the debt. The sale was to be held on the courthouse steps the following Monday. That Monday was a grey, overcast day that matched the mood of the crowd. Warren Slater was there, standing off to the side with his wife, looking like a man attending his own execution. The auctioneer, a man from the city in a suit that looked out of place, started with the expansion parcels first. The 800 acres Slater had bought during the boom years were sold off in big blocks to an insurance company and a group of distant investors. The prices were heartbreakingly low, barely enough to cover a fraction of what Slater had owed. Finally, there was only one parcel left, the home quarter, the original 160 acres that Slater's grandfather had homesteaded. It was the heart and soul of the farm, the location of the house, the barns, the history. "All right, folks," the auctioneer called out, his voice thin in the cold air. "The last parcel for sale today. 160 acres more or less, with improvements, a fine home, good barns. Who'll start the bidding?" A heavy silence fell over the crowd. No one wanted to be the one to take a man's home. It felt ghoulish. Slater closed his eyes, his face pale. From the back of the crowd, a quiet voice spoke up. "I'll bid." Every head turned. It was Silas Blackwood. He stood there in his simple work coat and worn boots, his face calm and resolute. He made his bid, a low but fair number based on the land's true, sustainable value, not the inflated fantasies of the past. The auctioneer looked around. "I have a bid. Do I hear another?" Silence. The investors had gotten what they wanted. The local farmers didn't have the cash or the credit to bid against him. "Going once," the auctioneer said, his gaze sweeping the crowd. "Going twice." He looked at Silas, who gave a single firm nod. "Sold!" he cried, his gavel falling with a sharp crack. "To Mr. Silas Blackwood." A murmur went through the crowd. Silas didn't acknowledge them. He walked past the auctioneer and straight over to where Warren Slater was standing, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Slater wouldn't look at him. He just stared at the courthouse steps, his life's work erased. "Warren," Silas said softly. Slater finally looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and despair. "Just get it over with, Blackwood. You won. You get to kick me off my own land. Enjoy it." "That's not why I'm here," Silas said, his voice steady. He held out a set of keys, the keys to the house. "I'm going to need help farming this place. It's too much for one man. I'll rent the house to you and your family for $1 a year. You work for me. We'll run it together." Warren stared at him, his mouth agape. He looked at the keys, then back at Silas's face, searching for the trick, for the mockery. He found none. All he saw was a simple, honest offer. It was an act of grace, so profound it shattered what little pride he had left. His eyes welled up, and for the first time, the broken man wept. He took the keys. The talk at the diner that week wasn't about interest rates or crop prices. It was about Silas Blackwood. The man they had dismissed as a backwards-thinking fool was now seen in a new light. He wasn't just a survivor. He was a leader. His quiet wisdom, once scorned, was now sought after. He hadn't just weathered the storm. He had provided a harbor for his former rival. The respect he was given was not for the land he had bought, but for the decency he had shown. The years that followed were healing years. The farm economy slowly clawed its way back. Silas and Warren, an unlikely partnership forged in the fires of the crisis, worked the combined acreage together. Warren, humbled and grateful, brought his knowledge of modern cropping techniques. Silas brought his mechanical genius and his unwavering financial discipline. They were a formidable team. Silas never expanded aggressively. He bought a neighboring 80 acres once, when the family retired, and he paid for it in cash. His farm grew, but it grew organically, its roots deep and secure in debt-free soil. By 1999, the world was a different place. The farm crisis was a scar, a memory that had shaped a generation. Silas was now in his 50s, his hair grey at the temples, his hands permanently stained with the story of his life's work. His son, David, had just graduated from agricultural college and was coming home to the farm. One bright summer day, Silas, David, and a much older, quieter Warren Slater stood in the gleaming showroom of the John Deere dealership. The machines were giants, technological marvels that made the 7700 of the past look like a toy. David's eyes were wide with the ambition of youth. He walked around the centerpiece of the showroom floor, a brand-new John Deere 9650 STS combine. It had a 600-bushel grain tank, a computerized yield monitor, and the revolutionary single-tine separator technology. "This is it, Dad," David said, his voice full of excitement. "This is the future. We could replace the whole fleet. Think of the efficiency. We should get 5 of these." The salesman, a young man in a crisp green polo shirt, who saw only an old farmer in a dusty cap, let out a condescending chuckle. 5 of them, huh? You've got big dreams, son. Let's start by seeing if we can get you qualified for one. Silas didn't say a word. Warren Slater just smiled a little, a sad, knowing smile. Silas walked over to the salesman's desk, pulled the worn leather checkbook from his back pocket, and sat down. He looked at his son. "We'll start with one," Silas said calmly. He picked up a pen, and in his neat, careful script, he wrote a check to the John Deere dealership for the full purchase price of the combine. He tore it from the book and slid it across the desk to the salesman. The young man's eyes went wide. He picked up the check, staring at the number of zeros as if it were written in a foreign language. His smug smile vanished, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. He looked up at Silas, his mouth opening and closing silently. As they walked out into the sunshine, David was buzzing. "I can't believe you did that, Dad. Just paid for it." Silas stopped and put a hand on his son's shoulder, his gaze turning toward the horizon, toward the fields that stretched out before them. "I want you to understand something," he said, his voice imbued with the weight of memory. "This isn't about the machine. It's about what it means to own it." He told him the story then, the whole story. He told him about the broken chain on the old Alice Chalmers, about the smug look on Warren Slater's face, about the years of struggle and ridicule. He told him about the auction, about the shame in a good man's eyes, and about the quiet satisfaction of holding a deed stamped, paid in full. "That man in there," Silas said, nodding back toward the dealership. "He thinks wealth is about how much you can borrow. Your grandfather taught me, and I'm teaching you, that true wealth is about how much you don't owe. The goal isn't to be the biggest farmer in the county. It never was. The goal is to be the last one standing. The goal is to pass this land on to your children, just like it was passed on to me, free and clear of any man's claim, except our own." He looked over at Warren, who nodded in silent agreement. Then he looked at his son, whose youthful excitement had been replaced by a new, deeper understanding. Later that fall, from the porch of his house, Silas watched the new green combine move across his fields. It moved with a speed and power he could never have imagined all those years ago, when he was wrestling with a broken chain in the dust. At the controls was his son, David, and in the buddy seat next to him, pointing and explaining, was Warren Slater. The old rivals, now mentors, were guiding the next generation. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the golden stubble. The land was quiet, peaceful, and secure. It was his. Every acre, every kernel of corn in the grain tank, every bolt on the new machine in the field. It was all his. He had won his war, not by getting bigger, but by getting stronger, by staying true to the simple, profound wisdom of the soil. And that was a legacy more valuable than any empire.